It is Sunday, July 2nd, Monday, July 1st for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I hope all my Canadians out there had a wonderful Canada Day. Here in the United States, we have Independence Day coming up on Tuesday. Super excited about that. Make it Independence Day, Codependence Day. It's my anniversary, so that should be pretty epic. Yeah, I hope you guys have had a pretty awesome weekend so far. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and we are broadcasting live from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. If you're listening to us live, you may be listening to us on KPNL Radio, which you can find on KPNL Radio at kpnl-db.com. You may also find us on eTalk Radio, which you can find at etalk.tv/radio. If you want to listen to us in your free time, whether you're working it, or working out, please tune in to us under We Are Paradox Media at Spreaker, Twitter, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Facebook, CastBox, Tumblr, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podcast Chaser, and Podvine. We are also live tonight on YouTube as well as Facebook and Twitch. If you don't mind, please mosey on over to our YouTube channel, We Are Paradox Media. Please like any video that you've watched or listened to, and please subscribe if you don't mind, and give that bell a little tickle. That way, next time we have a show come out, you shall be privy to it. So tonight, we have a treat for all my guys and gals out there. So tonight, we have a special guest, one of my favorites, Mr. Stephen B Ubaney, and he's the holder of 4 collegiate degrees and has been inducted into multiple national and international honor societies. He is a Who Murdered Elvis book conversant graduate of the University of Buffalo with a BA in Communications and Media Theory. Writing as a novice, Mr. Ubaney published numerous op-eds in multiple newspapers. He also authored articles that were published in magazines and trade publications. In 2013, he emerged his love of history with his quest for the truth, and he became the architect of the Who Murdered book series. So since the inception of the series, numerous volumes have been published as he works toward the completion of a 6-volume set. And I believe that's going to be taken down to a 5-volume set, which is scheduled for completion this year. So his research on numerous subjects has made him a frequent guest on television, radio, and podcast programs worldwide, and his knowledge into his subject matter is quite in-depth. Since the publication of the first volume in the series Who Murdered Elvis, his work has generated a cult following, and it is not uncommon for physical copies of his books to sell for hundreds of dollars on the open market. Mr. Ubaney's family history is a fascinating one. The unsubstantiated work of one ancestral researcher claims that his family can be traced back to the cousin of the Virgin Mother and 2 members of the Knights Templar. That is very intriguing. The work is in progress to validate that claim. What has been substantiated is that he is a direct descendant of Charlemagne, and his 10th grandfather, William Chase, came to America on the Winthrop fleet in 1630. William Chase's son Benjamin married Philippa Sherman, daughter of the Honorable Philip Sherman, who was the first Secretary of Rhode Island. Mr. Ubaney is the 10th great-grandchild of Philip Sherman. Welcome, Stephen, and thanks for coming to hang out with us tonight.
Hey, I heard you missed me, so I'm back.
I did. I was like, man, it's been a week. Where the heck is that guy?
I did the hat trick. This is the 3rd time, I think, right, on your show?
Yes.
So today we're going to learn a little bit about FDR.
Yes, we are. And actually, it's kind of funny how FDR and Elvis kind of collude there, because I believe when Elvis was a boy, FDR was president, and I don't know, he wasn't too good at money. He was pretty good at politics, but not really the money aspect of it.
He was an interesting figure, and he kind of gets paid. That was a while ago. We're going back 80 years, so there's a lot covered in dust about FDR. So That's why some people, it's a while ago, so some people are like, "What are you writing about FDR for? It was so long ago." I just thought it was a fascinating subject, and I don't think there's any greater evidence that anyone was murdered than FDR, especially when you look back after decades and decades. So, um, yeah, he was a great president, a great war president. I think he cared about people. Of course, with all the good that's said about any human being, you can say a few things that are not so great. He, FDR he liked the communist ideology. And when I say that, I have to put an asterisk next to that because we didn't know communism. They didn't know communism as we know it today. It was pushed as this cradle to grave society where everyone was cared for, and it had nothing to do with evil empires and nothing like that. So back then, to them, communism was this new great thing that you could escape the rise and fall of capitalism and the capitalist markets, because you have to remember the Roaring Twenties crashed, and they blame capitalism for the crash. So now here comes FDR in the next few years, and he's embracing communism. So communism won't crash. So
Yeah, and it was kind of funny, like when he was introduced to it, didn't they like have this whole setup to just make everything look beautiful and lovely and everything's perfect, and then behind the scenes it was actually quite ugly.
yeah, the Soviet Union was they were very sharp. They're smart people. They extended invitations to people in academia, people in the news media, people in Hollywood, and other dignitaries and people of influence to come to the Soviet Union and take a look around at this new marvel that is sweeping the world called communism. And what they showed them was a quote unquote Potemkin village, which basically means a cardboard village that doesn't function. It's basically Main Street USA in Disney World.
Right?
you know, it's painted up. It looks great. Everybody looks happy, but it it was just it was imitation. It was world. So these people got sent back to the United States with packets from the Soviet Union as to how they could transform their capitalist society into this utopian society of communism. So the CPUSA, Communist Party of the United States of America, who was already formed in this country, and it's still around, believe it or not. If you go to cpusa.org or .com, I can't remember which one it was. They're still around in New York City. That's where they're headquartered. And then visit the web page. You'll be surprised what political platform they're supporting. It's it's amazing. So communism in America had a foothold back when Woodrow Wilson started. Of course, Woodrow Wilson and FDR had they chewed the same dirt. We're dealing with old money here. Woodrow Wilson came out of academia, and he made FDR Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So FDR got his start under Woodrow Wilson, who Woodrow Wilson did not like the Constitution as it was written. He did not like the three branches of government. He liked oh boy, I'm trying to think. Come on, Steve, think about it. Well, I'm trying to think of what form of government that he liked, where the judicial and the legislative branches were combined. The parliamentary system. There we go.
Yes.
So he was not a real fan of the Constitution, and I think some of that he felt that it could have been improved, and I think it's some of that bled over into FDR, which um, idealized this new fascinating ideology called communism. And it doesn't mean he was a bad guy. I just think that, it was a new thing and nobody really knew what it was. But
Yeah,
it
I think
sounded,
a lot of people, even like not even in politics, but in Hollywood, were a bit misdirected. I just read, I believe it was last weekend after the show that I did with you, I did Storytime with Me, and I believe Lucille Ball and her old man came up on the radar there as far as having communist meetings or whatnot in her home. Supposedly she was not there for it, but It is on record, and they have so many records of so many different people that have been a part of it. It's kind of insane.
Yeah, they definitely had a foothold in this country, and it's really incredible when you think about, the CPUSA has been around since 1919, and they had operatives who felt that they were doing the right thing for America. So um, one of them was, pardon me, was Colonel Edwin Mandel House, who was the close ally to Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson is being buddied up with this person who later on they determined was writing communist literature and putting it in newspapers. So they were pretty influential, more so than we knew at the time. Of course, decades later, you go back and say, "Oh, wow, look at that!" But we didn't know that at that time. So um, there's a lot of people here very influential in and around FDR who are communists. And communist wasn't the big hot button term back then as it was today. They didn't know about evil empires or anything like that. It was, so you have to, like I said, when you say FDR was a communist, you have to kind of put a little asterisk next to that because of the time period in history. A lot of people were communists who had no idea what it really was going to blossom into.
Yeah.
So, um, also who was very active in the CPUSA was a fellow who was in FDR's cabinet who became very close to his wife there, Eleanor, was Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins was connected with Eleanor Roosevelt through the CPUSA, and he was very fundamental in FDR's inner circle. If you call it cabinet or not, I don't know, but he was the one who did the Lend-Lease program. He did the New Deal for FDR. He was instrumental in bringing forth a lot of things that were coming out of the CPUSA at that time. So there were so many communists in and around FDR, and I mean, it was amazing. I mean, everyone from Harry Dexter White to Alger Hiss, they were communists, and they were exposed by Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley, who had huge spy rings in the U.S. government, communist spy rings. So you got to understand, back then they thought they were doing the right thing. So you can't really fault these people. You have to kind of put that little asterisk next to their names.
Yeah,
So
and
what?
it's like, they're totally misdirected and they don't really know what it's all about. They think they do because of, like you said, Main Street USA or this beautiful little thing that they put up to show like how well this works when in reality it's bad. Bad for the community. Um, they're thinking of doing the best for us and they're thinking this is a good thing by what they've been shown. Like how are they supposed to know any better until, you really get your feet wet in there.
It was a fascinating period in time, very pivotal period in time for America, and Americans don't know much about it anymore. It's a generation past now, and it's important that we learn these lessons. I think that we move on. So I'm a history guy first. I
Yeah.
don't go around looking for conspiracy. I don't know if the Earth is flat or round. All I care is that I'm on it. All right. I
Right?
don't. I don't. I don't run around, trying to find these conspiracies. I dig into history and I do find conspiracies, and I know them when I find them. But that's not where I hang my hat. I like this stuff, the boring stuff, the history stuff. That's what I do. There's. I just wanted to run down a short list of the places in government where communists, we were later told or revealed that they were in power. The Public Welfare Committee, the U.S. Treasury Department. We had communists in the U.S. Treasury Department. Think about that. The Price Administration, the War Production Board, the Labor Advisory Board, the National Labor Relations Board, the State Department. We had communists in the State Department, the Attorney General's office, and lastly, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. All of these things were either changed by FDR or put into place by FDR. And of course, when Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley were caught, they decided to sing a little song, and they blew everybody in. So we were very well surrounded, or infiltrated, or influenced by the communist element in our government during that time. So kind of interesting period in time. Of course, what we're told about in history right now is FDR was, and he was a savior of this, and everybody loved him, and this and that and the other thing. And he helped a lot of people. A lot of people were starving, and he helped them through a bad time in America. He did a lot of good for a lot of people. You can't say he didn't. But it's how he went about some things that infuriated people.
Yeah. He
There
did
were
produce
people.
a lot of jobs and everything as far as like rebuilding roads, so on and so forth, but yeah, he wasn't too good at that part of it. He was good at war games and stuff like that, but otherwise
Yeah,
everybody's just throwing up their hands like what's happening?
I think that FDR was the greatest president we ever had in war, because he got a chance to use that cunning side of him. The guy was just so smart. I mean, he was so far ahead of everybody militarily. Thinking in advancement and strategy. He just it was really pretty fantastic. You think about how smart he was, but a lot of people in America hated him. And when I mentioned this in this book, Who Murdered FDR, a lot of people didn't like it, especially people who were not necessarily on the conservative side of life. There were some people who were Democrats and liberals who took exception to it, and I had to explain to them, look, this is a book about who murdered FDR. I have to talk about his enemies. And I had to tell them, look, I don't care how you vote. I don't care if you vote. I'm writing the story about this. I'm revealing information. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Don't take it personally. So some of the people, here's a short list of people who really hated FDR. They were big, big money people. And FDR was taxing industry to the point where he didn't know this, I'm sure, but he was prolonging the Great Depression because they were so heavily taxed they couldn't create jobs. So DuPont Chemicals, George Eastman Kodak, Henry Firestone, Samuel Colgate, Henry Ford, the Frick family with Carnegie Steel, the Heinz family, the Hiltons, the Mellon family, Robert Woodruff, who was chairman of the board of Coca-Cola. And these are some of the people in America who were the wealthy of the wealthy, who really couldn't stand this guy because he wouldn't let them make any money. The markets were just all tied up. He was really giving them fits of rage. And of course, we don't hear about that in history. We just hear about the other side of how wonderful he was. And he did some great things, but not everything he did was great.
Yeah, you can't make everybody happy, and like you're saying, the rich really get offended, even though they're the lower percentage of our population. They really have a strong pool. And when he was in power, they were really hating it. Like they didn't like it whatsoever. I know Churchill tried to get in pretty close with him, but him and Churchill didn't really jive due to the whole communist thing. I mean, it's kind of intriguing just to look at the whole thing happen.
And it's really a fascinating time in history to look back. All of these people who I mentioned, from DuPont all the way to Robert Woodruff, and this is where the story gets interesting, they had all had their portraits painted by this Russian painter, Elizabeth Shumatov. Her and her husband, Leo, defected from, and she wrote a book, actually. Most of this is in her book. They defected from the USSR to come to America. And she was a fantastic portrait painter. And as a matter of fact, FDR died right in front of her.
I know that was kind of shady.
She
It's like,
had painted,
what's happening here?
she had painted FDR's portrait earlier on in his presidency. And then she was kind of like in the Garden Club. She was painting all of these famous people's portraits. And you can look up her work. She's remarkably talented. I mean, really, really fantastic. So she's in the presence of all these people who hate FDR.
Well, did she
And
not like him too? Like I kind of picked up like she didn't really care too much for him.
I think I don't really remember how it's put in her book. I don't think she thought much of him at first, but I think she grew to like him. So in her book, I mean, she's an Ivanov. I mean, she comes from some class over there. She was definitely not a commoner. She was a daughter of General Ivanov. So she comes over. Her family was held high office in the government, and according to her book, she came to America with her husband Leo on a mission from the provincial governor. Well, I'm telling you, I just can't get this right. Can I? Let me try that again. Take two. Okay, let's try that again. She came to America with her husband Leo on a mission for the provincial government headed by Alexander Kerensky. And so here and Leo Shumatov, now you got to remember, these people barely speak English. They're in a foreign country. She manages to paint her way into the upper crust of our society, and he goes to work for the Sikorsky Aviation Company, and they're bouncing around New York State, and they're always finding other Russians. So you
I
have to
know
kind of
they
ask.
had different cliques and private lines and stuff like that. It was pretty intriguing. People that used to play with the ham radio and stuff used to pick up on certain privy discussions and such. It was pretty interesting.
They definitely had an underground that were helping them out. So because he was a business manager for the Sikorsky Aviation Corporation, and he knew nothing about aviation. So number one, how would you do that? Would you go to Russia and all of a sudden just start contacting other Americans in government, and then
I don't think so.
end up bouncing all around the USSR?
Right?
No, there was quite a network in place for these people. So uh,
Jay in the chat room was wondering, have you read FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law by Curtis B. Dahl?
I have not read that one.
He says you really should.
Okay, let me write it down. I will. Let me get a pencil and write it down. What was it? What was the title of it?
FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law by Curtis B. Dahl. Dall.
I will read it. I had to read. I can't even begin to tell you how much research went into this. I had to read and read and read and read and read and read, and you can't get them all.
Right.
That's one that slipped between my fingers. You can't get them all, even with the greatest of intentions. A book or two slips by. That one I didn't read, but I will. I'll read it. So the plot is thickening here in America. FDR is surrounded by some people who are not fond of him. There were also people in the White House who were not fond of him. He was having FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. He was having a romantic liaison with her secretary,
Oh my
and
goodness.
he Missy LeHand was his personal secretary, and he was also having relations with her, and he was stepping on a lot of toes of
I
people
mean, they,
inside.
yeah, they say stuff like, if you can't keep it in your pants, keep it in the family. And yes, he married his cousin, so I can kind of relate to the guy. I don't know.
It's a lot of people married their cousins. Believe it or not, it was. I know this sounds crazy today, but I mean that was kind of commonplace. Um, if you go back to Princess Diana and Prince Charles, they were cousins. If you remember Gone with the Wind, the Wilkses always marry their cousins. It's crazy, but I mean, there was a time in American history when that was, it was commonplace because they wanted to protect their bloodline. You know, sounds crazy today,
Yeah,
but
didn't Theodore give him the elbow and a way to keep the bloodline pure there?
yeah, that was a really that was a that was a bizarre. situation. I mean, Eleanor was born to Roosevelt, married to Roosevelt, died a Roosevelt. The woman never had to change her monogram in her entire life. You know, it was uh, it was a very bizarre situation to say the least. Uh, but it happened. You know, that's kind of the way it is. So all of this is surrounding FDR, and of course, there's a lot of other things going on. America is in the throes of war. Um,
And you had
and
just brought up, when I so rudely interrupted you, people in the White House that didn't care too much for him.
yeah, he was stepping on some toes, and it was really the plot is really thickening around this guy, and he strangely or conveniently or inconveniently dies in the presence of a Russian spy and her the person who helps her do her painting. There was she traveled with a photographer, and this is the man's name was his nationalization papers were Nicholas Kubakinski. Okay, and then it went from Nicholas Kubakinski to Nicholas Cobbins, and it went from Nicholas Cobbins to Nicholas Robbins. So here we have two people with FDR in the little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, and there's Secret Service is just not anywhere to be found, and he's in there with with Elizabeth Shumatov, whose husband is on a quote unquote on a mission from the Russian government, and this other guy who is helping her going around the world or the country rather, in the presence of people who hate FDR, and he mysteriously dies in front of them. I mean, you can't make this up. How can you got to remember this is the peak of the greatest war we've ever had. How is Secret Service letting these people through? I mean, it's impossible for them to check these people out when this guy's nationalization papers are Nicholas Kubakinski and he's going by an alias of Nicholas Robbins. There's no way they could have checked these people out. It's a very bizarre circumstance. Very bizarre indeed. So all of this is going on. We have all of these people in and around Roosevelt who are not necessarily fond of Roosevelt. And I would have to say that even Eleanor was a little miffed. I mean, here she is being the good wife, and she knows that he's having affairs, and it's a bad situation. There's a lot of bad blood in the White House. So, murdering FDR should not be a surprise to anyone because he just got into office, and there was an attempt on his life. And it's well documented. In 1933, a guy named Giuseppe Zangara tried to murder FDR when he was in Miami. He tried to shoot him, and he missed. And he ended up shooting the mayor of Chicago.
Oh no.
And I mean, the poor guy was he must have been a hell of a bad shot. He was just standing next to FDR, and this poor guy gets shot. His name was Anton Cermak, and he was shot and killed. And this guy got the electric chair.
Oh
And
wow.
this is This is in the history books. Google it. Look it up. If you can trust Google to tell you the truth about anything anymore, but
Right.
look it up. It's out there. There were people who did not like this guy. Um, so he gets elected. He makes some changes. He brings in the New Deal. And America's in trouble economically at the time. The New Deal is helping people, but it's not. I mean, it's helping people get through, it's helping people survive because there were no social programs like we have today. So it did a lot of good for a lot of people, but it wasn't the answer. They tried to push the second New Deal, and it didn't work. Nobody went for it. So the that's when packing the court came about. He thought if he packed the court with his people, he'd be able to get the second New Deal in. So FDR knew he had to get us into war for a couple reasons. Um, everybody thinks that we talk about other people's spies, the Russian spies and the Nazi spies, and they're real. As a matter of fact, there were spy rings in America that were caught, and some of them were executed. Operation Pastorius was a Nazi spy ring, and 8 members they were all caught, and 8 members, and they were trying to attack civilian targets and heads of state, and they got the electric chair. The Duquesne spy ring, 33 members, another Nazi spy ring. They were all caught. I mean, this is real stuff. But America has spies too. When nobody talks about that. I mean, we're as good as they are, folks. And what was coming back was that the Nazis are pretty smart people, and they have V2 rockets, and they were getting close to finishing their heavy water experiments. And if they were going to develop the bomb with their V2 rockets to take that bomb to the four corners of the world, they'd conquer the world. And they were really, really close. I mean, I don't think that we know how close they were. FDR knew that he had to get this country into war, and he had to stop that. And he made some of the hardest decisions I think anybody has ever had to make, Pearl Harbor was the catalyst, of course, we know that. And
They totally messed that up, man. I was just like, holy crap. They knew it was coming.
The History Channel put out a document which has now disappeared, surprisingly.
Really?
2 documents about this have disappeared, and I wonder why, because I just looked them up. And it's odd that this has disappeared, and I'm actually going to inquire why. Because I want to know what history's being erased. Thanks, but the History Channel put out that we'd already broken the Japanese code, and we knew that they were going to attack. So the Japanese were in an interesting position. There's a big global chess match going on. Japan had just ended a war with China, and it was horrible. It was a horrible war. The last thing they wanted to do was go to war with the United States. They are an interesting country. They have few natural resources, and they're an oil debtor nation. They don't have enough oil to support anything, their industry, their military, anything. And FDR shut off their oil. And it put them in a situation where they had to go island hopping to get oil. So all of this is going on in the Pacific. Forget Hitler, forget the other side of the world. This is going on in the Pacific. And, it's not good. They had broken the Japanese code. They knew what was coming. I don't know if they necessarily knew where it was coming. I think they had an idea, because some of the most important ships were taken out of the harbor that night.
Well, and definitely taking over Hawaii. That'd be perfect for them.
Yeah, they were definitely. Japanese are pretty fantastic people. They're very disciplined. To their cause, and when they wage war, they don't play games. I mean, they're those are tough folks, man.
Well, they did a really good job of like hitting the ships, but not hitting the compounds and different things like that they would need to use for their own military. Like they were right on with what they were doing. I hate it because it's our soldiers, but man, they did a pretty epic job with that.
Yeah, and this was in the History Channel, and it has gone away now, which is interesting, and I'm kind of curious. This was all put out in the History Channel on their website, and it guess what? It'd be gone. I was looking for it the other day, and I'm going to have to dig into exactly why they pulled that back, because FDR had to let that happen. He had to sell the American people on the war, because he knew what was coming with the V2 rockets. There's no way that he could let them get nuclear weaponry. We'd all be speaking German right now. So we had our own little spy network who was bleeding information back, saying, "Hey, look, we need to get into this. We get into this now." So he had a gut-wrenching decision to make. he had to let the attack happen to get the American people involved and sell them on the idea of going to war. And it was a tough time, you know. I mean, you think about the sleepless night that were the nights, sleepless nights that would happen when you're waiting for someone to make that happen. But you know that tell that to the 5 million mothers of the soldiers that would be killed if they actually got a nuclear weapon.
Right. And Jason in the chat room saying the warning on Pearl Harbor attack came to commercial Western Union wire that is in the book that he was telling us about earlier. And he also said earlier that you're really going to love that book when you read it. But he was saying that they knew about the attack about 15 hours ahead of time, and FDR let it happen. I don't know. I think there was some confusion there, like, no way is this happening, and whatever. Like, they were prepared, but at the same time, not really taking it seriously.
They needed to let something happen. They needed to get into the war big time.
Yeah, exactly.
So they needed to get into the Lend-Lease program, which they did because we needed to get this country moving economically. And of course, a war will do that, and helping your allies will do that with military weaponry as well. So all of this is going on at the same time. We have these people who are around FDR who are not necessarily happy with FDR. It's a very interesting time in America. America is getting its mettle tested on the world stage, probably for the first time at this level. I mean, the Nazis were very interesting people. They had a jump on us militarily. Hitler was pretty shrewd. He under the cover of other buildings like elementary schools and high schools and this and that, he was building factories and manufacturing airplanes and things like this, and no one knew what was going on. This was all a hidden military tiger that he was building, to the surprise of the entire world. And when he went to mobilize, people were shocked as to how he took this country from the grips of depression all the way to almost global domination. I mean, they were pretty advanced, and they had a lot of military might. So we had to really, what saved us was the mass production that America could do. The soldiers were off to war, and their wives are making planes. And the same thing was happening in England. There's an interview in the book with myself and my aunt, who was building Spitfires in Britain. And there's an interview with her and a story that she told about the strafing run that it wiped out the factory she was building Spitfires in, and almost killed all of them. I mean, they bombed Britain incredibly, night after night after night, trying to get these people to surrender, and Britain just was not having it. Pretty tough people. So all of this is going on at the exact same time. We're trying to go to war. The economy's a mess, and enemies are mounting around FDR. So there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts to this book, and it was tough because I had to rely on some information that is uncomfortable. Sometimes I don't necessarily like some of the things that I run across, but it's part of factual history, so I have to put it in.
Right.
It can make you uncomfortable sometimes.
I know you actually got into a few libraries there, and were able to read a lot of stuff a lot of us aren't able to go and read ourselves. So I'm grateful that you were able to do that and to put this information into your book. I mean, I don't know. It's pretty mind-blowing.
I'm glad I did it. I wouldn't do it again. I had to go to, of course, I live in New York. I live in Western New York, around the Buffalo area, and I had to make the drive to Hyde Park, which is where, of course, FDR's mansion and now library is, the National Archives for his presidency. And I just basically lived there for a few days. And I went through some documents that that were really I found fascinating. I mean, I'm holding in my hand documents that are marked top secret about World War II that, 80 years prior or 75 years prior, would have been the top of top secret. I mean, only generals and things are getting these memos and so forth. So it was very interesting. If you have a chance to go to Hyde Park, New York, I would highly suggest it. They went through the place. They just got a huge grant, 30-some million, to redo
Oh, wow.
everything, and you can go through this. It's period specific, so you can walk through the time periods of. You could go through, the museum. You're walking. You're sitting at the kitchen table, and on the radio is one of his fireside chats. So it'll bring you back to that time period, and it'll walk you through the. It'll walk you through the authentic time period of what it would be like. So I found it was fascinating. But so FDR is starting to. He goes to the Tehran conference, of course, and he's they're trying to hash things out. You know, they didn't trust him and Churchill. They were together in this thing, I think, very, very early on, if not from day one. And Churchill needed this is where the Lend-Lease came in. Churchill needed the resources that we had to, food, oil, and other materials that that we had to make this work. We were doing the Lend-Lease program to China and the Soviet Union and other allied nations, and they were building planes and warships and all kinds of other weaponry. And without that, none of the allies could have withstood what Hitler was bringing to them. So all of this is going on, and they go to the Tehran conference from end of November to early December 1943, and here's where his health starts getting crazy. He had some great doctors. Of course, he was a Navy man, so Admiral Ross McIntyre was the head surgeon. He was the vice admiral, surgeon general of the Navy, and he was his doctor from 1932 all the way up until his death in 1945. And he ended up writing the book in 1946, The White House Physician. So he was the head doctor. He also had Lieutenant Commander of the Navy, Dr. Harold Bruin. And these guys were really in charge of the president, administering his medicines and taking care of him health-wise. But there's some interesting things going on that make no sense to these people. FDR's blood pressure is going out of control, usually after meal times. He would have, it would be a normal blood pressure, or what would be considered close to normal. And then it would go crazy, 310 over 190, and it would spiral out of control, and the guy would pass out. And, a time would pass. They'd administer drugs and this and that and the other thing, and nothing was working. And then after a time, it would come back to normal, 3-4 hours later or whatever it was. And they just couldn't figure out what was going on. They're like, why is this guy's body not responding to anything we're giving to it? It doesn't make any sense. And other authors have tried to solve this too. There's a couple doctors who wrote a book saying that FDR had cancer because they saw a spot over one of his eyebrows, a little mole that was changing and this and that, and they thought that he had cancer and it was going into his brain and it was affecting his body and this and that. And I really dug into this, and I asked a few other doctors, including a medical examiner, and we all kind of concluded the same thing, that people who have cancer don't really go in this bipolar health schism. They tend to just gradually get weaker and weaker, and it's a long, involved process, and they just kind of fade away and die. They don't have this violent, back and forth from, death's door to regular health. And So we had to kind of dismiss that away when we were figuring this out. And we have to talk about, I have to put an asterisk here next to FDR's health. FDR his whole life was a pretty healthy physical specimen of a guy. And, he ended up with, I guess it would consider it infantile paralysis or polio. I'm trying to think of what they would call it today. And he
When it comes to my mind, I think polio. Man, he worked so hard, and he did a really good job kind of covering that up.
He didn't have the use of his arms or his legs for a while. And I don't know how they didn't put this guy in an iron lung, because I don't know how he survived it any other way, but he did. So what they did is they put bars over his bed, and he would force his arms to work little by little by little, and he worked out with his arms, and he managed to get his arms back to normal, and his legs never came back to normal. So what he would do early on in his career, this was even before he was president. I know I just bounced backwards in the story. I'm sorry. But
oh no, I totally wanted to go over this stuff because for me, like, that's what really inspired me about this president was the things that he overcame as far as his health and how hard and determined he was to work through it, and the different things that he did do to make himself look strong and normal when in reality he's got issues going on.
the guy was suffering something terrible, but he was in pretty good shape for the shape that he was in. He would go walking, quote unquote walking, trying to get his legs to work, and walking to him was putting his legs in 15-pound shackles, and using his arms with crutches and basically dragging his legs behind him. And he did this every day in an attempt to try and get his legs to function again, that's a lot of raw courage. That's a courageous man there. And of course, he did not fight the good fight, but he certainly fought the fight. So you have to admire the guy for that. So when we talk about all these health problems that he was having later on, after he got to the point where he accepted the fact that his legs were no longer going to work for him, he used some braces, and with the use of hanging on to somebody with one arm and using a crutch of the other arm, he could actually give the appearance of taking a couple steps. And of course, the media was very, very fond of him, so they never showed anything unflattering of him, or anything that would put him into bad light, that he was crippled or anything like that. Because back then they thought that if you were physically impaired, you had to be mentally impaired too. And of course, today we know that's not true.
Yeah, it's pretty shallow.
It was just a different time. So
yeah,
he was in pretty good shape for the shape that he was in. He was very strong with his upper body. His legs were atrophied, and they wouldn't have held him up anyway. The muscles were shot; they were gone. And there's a couple of photos now have leaked out where he was at Warm Springs, Georgia, and you can see this guy's legs look like little kids' legs.
oh,
It's really kind of sad. It really is. So, I mean, the use of his legs aside, when he became president, he enjoyed pretty decent health. They'd check his vitals and they'd make sure he was doing okay, and he was eating well, and he enjoyed fairly
his
good
food
health.
sucked.
Yeah.
Poor guy. I'm like, man, all I want is a good savory meal. That's how I felt through COVID. Like, I can't taste or smell anything. And I'm like, all I want is some good savory food. Nothing tastes good. Like, this poor guy didn't even have COVID, and he's got a shitty meal every meal of the day.
And I think that he would have probably begged for COVID, because he would beg not to have tasted
right?
it. So,
poor guy.
the big joke that we're talking about is the Henrietta Nesbitt was a White House cook, and she was friends. She was friends of Eleanor's. As a matter of fact, they were neighbors, and he was one of FDR's, she was one of FDR's wife's dearest friends, and she ended up being the White House cook, and she was certainly unqualified in which to do so. I mean, there are numerous accounts where I think the most vivid was Ernest Hemingway came to visit the White House, and he said the soup was like rainwater,
Oh no.
and it was just terrible. And there were multiple letters going back and forth that I saw in the archives where she was getting, he was telling her, look, I don't want to eat this anymore. I mean, she was serving him things like 15 days in a row. and it was terrible to boot. So they had this little thing going on, and I laughed out loud. I'm in the archives, and I'm going through these letters, and I just had to laugh. I mean, it was his writing in his stationery, and he's chewing out the White House cook. I thought, what a waste of it. What an ill use of the president's time.
Your food is very important for your health and mentally and physically. I don't know.
So, fast forward back to the Tehran conference, okay? Up to this point, FDR's been pretty virile. Can't use his legs, but he's a pretty healthy specimen of a guy. Has some super strong arms because that's what he's using to pull himself around with. So his body starts doing things that no one can understand what's going on. And this is when his doctors start going, uh-oh, we might have a problem here. So they started to notice a couple things, that he started to be sick after mealtime, lunchtime, dinner time, snack time, whatever. His body was not responding to medicines anymore. And they started to realize, there's something going on here that we don't really know about. So they put their heads together, and what they decided to do was get another opinion. So they took his health just became so terrible. If you look at the Tehran conference in 1943, and you look at what he looked like there, and the pictures are in my book, and you know what? I'll tell you how to get the book. Sorry, bad on me. This book is an ebook and audio book all the way around the world. It's Who Murdered FDR. You can pick it up there. If you want an autographed copy and you're in the U.S., you can go to my website, whomurderedbooks.com, and I'll send you an autographed copy. It's also in Kindle. I don't believe I have that one on Amazon. I don't believe that one is in print on Amazon, but it's on Amazon in every other way. So that's how you get the book. So they decide that they're going to, oh, wow, we've got to get somebody else involved here because this guy, we're kind of stumped. We don't know what's going on. So the big hotshot doctor of the day was Dr. Frank Leahy in Boston, who later he founded the Leahy Clinic, which is still in existence. And they released on the History Channel on April 12th, 2011, something else that the History Channel pulled off.
This is insane to me.
I don't know why. I looked for it the other day, and guess what? It's just not there anymore.
And like you said, it's so far back in history. Why does it even matter anymore? Why are they pulling this stuff? It's like they're still trying to keep us blind.
I wish I knew, but I mean, the letter is in my book, and it's from his foundation. It was a secret letter outlining what he found. He examined the president, and he found, oh boy, we've got a problem here. He's not suffering from the advance of polio. He's suffering from a poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
This guy is being poisoned. And it all started to come. I mean, they were baffled. They were sending him for x-rays. They were sending him for a barrage of tests, trying to scramble to find anything. And typically the advance of polio, again, as I lay out in the book, is you'll have muscle and joint weakness. You'll have muscle pain. You'll get exhausted. Fatigue. Yeah, I mean, you might have shallow breathing and sleep apnea. I think that almost everybody he had no clue as to what was going on. FDR is starting